It is now, when we are called as witness to the world, to mend it, to change its course, to restore it. It is now when we are called to act on our values, not to hide, not to fear, but to be bold and loud. It is now that we are called to continue our fight for justice, to organize, to speak up. It is now. Let us gather to give each other courage. Let us worship. We light a chalice, as I have one lit today, as Unitarian Universalists. And these words are by the Unitarian Universalist Association, UUA Leadership Council. They're called a vision for Unitarian Universalism in a multicultural world. So please light a chalice or a flame at home while we see this one lit today, and the one that will appear on your screen and remain on your screen for this program. Hear now these words. With humility and courage born of our history, we are called as Unitarian Universalists to build the beloved community, where all souls are welcome as blessings, and the human family lives whole and reconciled. With this vision in our hearts and minds, we light our chalice. There now, the congregation is gathered, and as Red River Unitarian Universalists always do when they gather, I invite you to say this spoken affirmation of their faith. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great truth, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in freedom, and to help one another. The opening thought for today comes from the prophet Joel in the 2nd chapter, a couple of verses, 28 and 29. They will be familiar to you no matter what your background, most likely, because the prophet Joel recorded this. It will happen afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions, and also on the servants and on the handmaids in those days, I will pour out my spirit. And now, the opening song for the morning, because above all, love will guide us.
Hope inside us will lead the way on the road from creed to king. Love will guide us through the hot night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us. Peace has tried us. Hope inside us will lead the way on the road.
It will be then a privilege to introduce to you the first reading for today, but it will not be read by me. You will hear today The Miracle of Morning by Amanda Gorman, read by her on a PBS NewsHour broadcast from January 15th of this year.
Hi, I'm Amanda Gorman, and this is my poem, The Miracle of Morning. I thought I'd awaken to a world in mourning, heavy clouds crowding, a society storming, but there's something different on this golden morning, something magical in the sunlight, wide and warming. I see a dad with a stroller taking a jog across the street. A bright-eyed girl chases her dog, a grandma on a porch fingers her rosaries. She grins as her young neighbor brings her groceries while we might feel small, separate, and all alone. Our people have never been more closely tethered because the question isn't if we can weather this unknown, but how we will weather this unknown together. So on this meaningful morn, we mourn and we mend like lights we can't be broken. Even when we bend as one, we will defeat both despair and disease. We stand with healthcare heroes and all employees, with families, libraries, waiters, schools, artists, businesses, restaurants, and hospitals hit hardest. We ignite, not in the light, but in lack thereof. For it is in loss that we truly learn to love. In this chaos, we will discover clarity. In suffering, we must find solidarity, for it's our grief that gives us our gratitude, shows us how to find hope if we ever shall lose it. So ensure that this ache wasn't endured in vain. Do not ignore the pain. Give it purpose. Use it. Read children's books. Dance alone to DJ music. Know that this distance will make our hearts grow fonder. From a wave of woes, our world will emerge stronger. We'll observe how the burdens braved by humankind are also the moments that make us humans kind. Let each dawn find us courageous, brought closer, heeding the light before the fight is over. When this ends, we'll smile sweetly, finally seeing, in testing times, we became the best of beings.
So there are practices in each of the programs that Red River Unitarian Universalists provide. Often when I do the program, it is a prayer because I'm a theist. And so for me, the practices are prayers often. And and you are indulgent of that. And I always say that, let it be unto you according to your faith. Today, however, I was moved to consider that our reflections and our meditations don't really need to go any farther than our own backyard, as Dorothy would have said, because perhaps the most important part of our morning program is the work we do within ourselves, the human work of getting our minds right. And so I thought I would share today for a reflection, simply some meditation on the humanist values that many of you share and affirm in your daily practice, perhaps, and certainly worth lifting up in our practices today. So I invite you to be centered with yourself in a spirit of rest, reflection. Getting our minds right sometimes is at least half the battle. And sometimes it really is a battle each day. So let's take some time to hear part of the values that humanism invites us to hold as sacred. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, informed by experience. Humanism encourages us to live life well and fully. Our knowledge of the world is derived by observation, science, the arts, inner experience, each subject to analysis by critical intelligence. Humans are an integral part of nature, the result of unguided evolutionary change, and we accept our life as all and enough. We welcome the challenges of the future and are drawn to and undaunted by the yet to be known. In our reflection today, we aim for our fullest possible development, finding wonder and awe in the joys and beauties of human existence, its challenges and tragedies, and even in the finality of death. Humanists long for a world of mutual care and concern, free of cruelty and its consequences, where differences are resolved cooperatively without resorting to violence. Humanists are concerned for the well-being of all, committed to diversity and respect those of differing views, yet humane views. Thus engaged in the flow of life, we aspire to this vision with the informed conviction that humanity has the ability to progress towards its highest ideals. The responsibility for our lives and the kind of world in which we live is ours and ours alone. In this reflection, we seek to get our mind right for the real world as we live in it, and enjoy a moment of silence before the music for meditation, which is for the world, for the earth, forever turning.
For the earth forever
One of the greatest humanists, possibly one of the most unexpected humanists, was the prophet who wrote Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. And that is our reading, our second reading. You will know these words. And if you get a little earworm with them, I will know your generation. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. A time for the reading and a time for the discourse. Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, the prophet. I'm sure I'm not saying it right, but I'm going to stick with my pronunciation through the end. This is probably many people's favorite part of the Hebrew Bible, especially if you're a humanist, because Kohelet, the preacher, was a humanist. The wisdom teachings from the third part of the Hebrew canon, the writings, they've stood the test of time, and they wound up being the lyrics to a pretty good song by Pete Seeger that he recorded in 1959. But you know, it didn't really get legs until the 1965 recording by the Byrds, which was top hit in 1965. It was #1 on the Billboard's chart that year. And if you've got that earworm singing, turn, 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 I do know your generation and you know mine. Call it the preacher. Ancient words, but still relevant? Now, I don't know about relevant. Relevant, irrelevant, it doesn't apply when you're talking about timeless truths. Well, I don't know, really. Think about it. It's not really giving us any otherworldly visions, not really giving us any information. He's observing how things tend to follow other things in order. Wisdom, just from observing the world. A time to laugh, a time to weep. Yes, of course, when you realize that while you've been laughing, your car was just towed. So obviously. I like to imagine what Kohelet's contemporaries thought of him. The other prophets in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. We don't know when. It's very fluid. So the other prophets, they're coming up with big psychedelic visions. They're seeing wheels within wheels and chariots in the sky, and they're having to come up with political predictions and oracles, ethics, commandments, and the voice of Yahweh to get into the Bible. They're doing all this. What does Kohelet have to say? Well, there's a time to rend and a time to sow. Oh, that's great, Kohelet. Cast away stones, gather stones together. So what, you KonMari your household and then you go buy towels? That's what you got? That's your idea of prophecy? A time to speak and a time to keep silent. I hate to invoke stereotypes, but it's entirely possible that Kohelet was a woman. Maybe somebody's auntie. Scholars admit that the women's voices in the Song of Songs might have been actually written by women. It's not impossible. We assume the Hebrew Bible was only men writing, but it's possible the Song of Deborah was written by, well, Deborah. It's possible Kohelet was a woman. It's unlikely though, because there's some serious misogyny in the rest of the chapter. But this many millennia later, we don't know. Maybe the sarcasm font got lost somehow in the translation. Doesn't matter. Kohelet is timeless. So authorship and relevance, not important. Kohelet reassures us that there was, and probably still is, a real world in which there is a time for every purpose under heaven, but established for human beings in a real world. And I have already said that as a white woman of a certain age, I may no longer be relevant to this world today, but that's all right, because parts of this world I'm not sure I want to be relevant to, and I'm not sure it's a real world anymore, so that's not important to me. And I'm guessing a lot of Kohelet's rival prophets may have been relevant then, but they didn't get a hit song in 1965, now did they? That's only for texts that are timeless and true and real. So I brought the preacher Kohelet and Amanda Gorman here today for you, hoping to connect the OG poet performer with the newest poet performers, the ones who are up and running now, so that some of us who can remember when there was a real world out there hope that there will be a real world once again. Now, my journey as a wannabe contributor to the greater good aligned with the progressives of my generation in the last century, who wanted to move away from the apartheid situation the US was in, away from war, away from inequality, and toward the beloved community. We were kind of caught flat-footed during the last half of the 20th and flat-footed at the beginning of this century. At the last couple of election cycles, we did a lot of nice maneuvers on the uneven parallel bars of politics lately, but we did not stick the landing in 2016, if you get my drift. And it showed. We did not reckon with the power of the backlash to our progressive, well-meaning, well-thought-out, polysyllabic, theoretical justifications and purity of purpose. And we did not reckon with the loss of the fairness doctrine in 1987, because we didn't know that the media would have that much power in light of our progressive, well-meaning, well-thought-out, polysyllabic, theoretical justifications and purity of purpose. We didn't reckon with the loss of the real world that came about when the media, unfettered, took over everybody's lives. So I'm here to talk about the last time there was a real world shared, by which I mean a shared consciousness about the facts that helped us define the real world. And then I want to talk about the new prophets who I'm hoping can return us to the real world, and talk about what us old prophets are going to do in the meantime. I have a few ideas. Look, a lot has been made of the political divisions lately. The evidence for those divisions is ugly, and it gets a lot of attention, too much attention, if you ask me. So I'm not going to give it any attention, because we've seen masterful reporting on how the media should not be covering the media covering the media. In my lifetime, I've seen how journalism has progressed from being a public good to being public enemy number one. And I think I can explain it, although it makes me have to say something that in my house would warrant what we call a geezer alert, which means that I'm about to say something that makes me sound like a cranky old geezer. It's very unattractive. But here we go. Look, there was a moment in time in the middle of the 20th century when the broadcast media was considered public good and not a profit center, when fair and balanced actually meant fair and balanced. It, it was located in the fairness doctrine, which was a law that you had to actually provide both sides of a topic. I won't go into detail, but kids, the reason for that was that at that time there were airwaves. This was before cable and internet had other ways of getting information to you. There were airwaves, and the government thought that those belonged to everybody. So the government said you shouldn't misuse them, and the white sort of hierarchy of educated folk put journalistic standards in place to regulate that. All right, that's a short, compressed, really obnoxious version of what it was. But what it boiled down to was that in 1972, we had Walter Cronkite. So I'm going to pause now for those of you who are younger to go Google Walter Cronkite. If you don't have time for that, let me just say this. Walter Cronkite in 1972 was the most trusted man in America. For those of you now, he was the equivalent of Tom Hanks, who is currently the most trusted person in America, which for good reason. Tom Hanks pretty trustworthy, but Walter Cronkite was the anchorman for the news at CBS. And this was before the news had to turn a profit. This was when news was a public good. All right. Walter Cronkite anchored the news. And at the end of the night, he would say, and that's the way it is. And we believed him. We could do that because there were standards in place, good, bad, or indifferent, biased as they might have been, there were still standards for factuality and balance in reporting. In 1987, the FCC formally repealed the fairness doctrine because it was now impossible, and cable and the internet broke that naive effort into a billion bits. And fast forward, we are now into the post-factual world that you will all recognize. It's not hyperbole to say that we now look out into the media environment and we do not recognize a real world. We can't recognize a real world. We're busy trying to create a virtual world that we can somehow live with. But the result of that has been the last 4 years of a fantasy land, a teacup ride that progressives like me and my cohort have not known how to deal with. Can we be honest here? We have not known how to deal with it. Progressive candidates did win the 2020 election. And perhaps we can now return to the work of the people. Many of us are breathing a sigh of relief, but everyone knows it wasn't white liberals who made that happen. For all our good intentions, it wasn't the white women like me. It wasn't really particularly the efforts of the white gentlemen. It's silly to say, is it silly to say that the power of whiteness is fading? Money still holds the power, but whiteness, I call it the unbearable whiteness of being. And I think taking a long view, whiteness was sort of like a a real estate bubble, or maybe tulip mania. For several hundred years, it was really quite the investment, and it paid off big time. It paid off so well that it was able to just simply uh, rape whole continents and do incredible damage. It was a horrible, horrible, but very profitable investment for some few people. But I think the bubble's about to burst, and I'm glad for that. But the generation I belong to, those of us who are in our whiteness, still waiting, hoping to use that power and privilege for good, we're waiting and saying, is it my turn now to use that? You know, the answer is no, it's not. No, because there is a new generation, young and strong and not white. So the generation I belong to, just when we have reached our time of wisdom, may need to step aside there when we can hear Amanda Gorman's close internal rhymes in poetry you can almost dance to, electrify a country on the day of the inauguration of an administration I hope we can hold accountable for real progress in this country. Amanda Gorman is only a part of Generation Z, the next generation in the waves of generations that are coming. Generation Z is majority non-white in the West and the South, and will be majority non-white overall by 2028. The post-war baby boom that I am part of is no longer the largest generation. The millennial generation have surpassed the post-war baby boom as the nation's largest living cohort of adults. I breathe a sigh of relief for that. Take it all with a big grain of salt, because generations are really just packs of people. But Generation Z, today's group, the leading edge, the second wave of millennials, are a remarkable group of individuals. They're on track to be becoming the best educated group of people ever. They have progressive values already in place. They are not divided by those ancient resentments and grudges and loss of privilege the way my generation are. They're ready to move. They're ready to be. They're ready. Because when the real world broke in on this group of newly emerged adults in the form of rising authoritarianism, a pandemic, and a climate crisis, it was as if the prophet Joel predicted. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Because while your old men were dreaming dreams, your young men will see visions. And also on the servants and the handmaids in those days, somebody was pouring out some spirit. And that group of young people rose to the occasion. Fostered by the aunties, fostered by the women of color who made things happen. And it's joyful that there has been progress in diversity in our government. It's joyful. Slow progress is agonizing, but still, it's not nothing that our government is beginning to reflect the actual character of the country. And it's even better that the new workers, the newly engaged in politics, are getting younger and younger. And this is better because the truth is, when you're young, you do see things more clearly. I did. We did. In my generation, oh, geezer alert, when I was young, We rejected a culture that we said was too plastic. Plastic, we said. And what is it that's now choking the ocean? And what is it that drove that fossil fuel extraction frenzy that caused the pollution, that caused the wars, that now exacerbates the climate crisis? Why? It was plastics. We were right. I said the new prophets need to lead us back to the real world. What did the former prophets need to do? You're wondering. Well, I, for one, am going to preserve what I can, preserve what I know, interrogate what I know about what makes for a real world. I believe Kohelet had it right. In the real world, there is time for each thing. Right now, it is time to plant hope, to kill animosity, to break down twisted systems, to weep for injustice, to mourn for lives needlessly lost, to cast away stones of resentment, to embrace our own accountability, to get wisdom, to keep faith, to rend our garments in remorse, to keep silence instead of hurting others, to love each other fiercely, to make war against the worst of our own warlike selves. And then we will turn towards one another, and we will turn in repentance, and we will turn off the television, because one day it will be time to die, but not before we have reaped what we have planted, healed what we could heal, laughed and built up, danced and gathered precious stones, refrained from embracing resentment, lost ourselves in joy, cast away tears, sewn our tents tight against the rain, spoken our hearts in fullness, hated everything that kept us apart, and finally one day made peace with ourselves, with one another, and with the world. And that's the way it is. Amen.
We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle round to tend these fires. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change alive from deep within the earth. It is time now. It is
I leave you with this parting thought. Let us ponder this in our heart. The world was not left to us by our parents. It was lent to us by our children. Please accept this blessing from a Baha'i prayer. Be generous in prosperity and thankful in adversity. Be a lamp to those who walk in darkness and a home to the stranger. Be a breath of life to the body of humankind, a dew to the soil of the human heart, and a fruit upon the tree of humility. And now we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Hello, members and friends of Rev UU. On February 14th, I'll be talking to you about my life in South America. I know that some of you have also had the experience of living in another country. I lived 7 years in South America, first as a Peace Corps volunteer in Chile in the mid-60s, and later with my wife and our kids in Colombia in the mid-70s. My experience in each country was profoundly different, but I can look back with many good feelings. I hope you will join me as I share some pieces of my life in South America on Sunday. Hasta el domingo. Que esté bien.